My grandmother was the most dangerous woman in 3 counties, and I did not understand that until the autumn she decided to ruin me. I say ruin, she would say saved. She has always been precise about the distinction. It began at Thornmere Park in October, when the trees along the South Drive had turned the color of old copper, and the house was full of people I had not invited. My grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Thornmere, had a particular habit of filling my house when the hunting season thinned the available society, and I had long since stopped arguing with her about it. She was 81 years old, sharp as a Sheffield blade, and she had outlasted 2 kings and 3 generations of men who thought they could tell her what to do. I was not so foolish as to try to be the 4th. There were 12 guests that October. I knew most of them. There was Lord Fenwick and his braying wife, the Honorable Miss Calverley, who had been aimed at me twice already by her mother, and who had the disconcerting habit of entering every room as though it had been waiting to applaud her, the Marchioness of Bradday and her 2 daughters, and a scattering of cousins and friends whose names I could recite in my sleep. I had no interest in any of them. I was 35. I was the Duke of Thornmere, and I had developed over the course of those 35 years a considerable facility for appearing to be present in a drawing room while actually being somewhere else entirely. My grandmother had never forgiven me for this talent. She considered it a waste. What I did not know, what my grandmother had very carefully not told me, was that she had also invited a Miss Elinor Voss. I noticed her at dinner on the first evening, which was itself unusual, because I had trained myself over years of these gatherings to notice as little as possible. She was seated at the far end of the table, between my cousin Frederick and old Penhaligon, and she was dressed in a gown the color of ash, quiet and plain and perfectly correct. She was not beautiful in the way the room expected beauty. She had no gilded hair, no dimpled cheeks, no artful blush arranged for public effect. She had a still face and dark eyes that were watching the conversation around her with what I can only describe as patient attention, the way a naturalist watches a tide pool, curious, alert, not yet ready to intervene. I looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds, then I looked away. I told myself I had noticed nothing in particular. At breakfast the next morning, my grandmother sat across from me with the satisfied expression of a woman who has already moved her pieces across the board, while the rest of us were still reading the rules. "Who is Miss Voss?" I asked, because I had learned that with my grandmother a direct question was always faster than waiting to be managed. "A sensible young woman," she said, reaching for the cream with the serenity of a woman who has never once been in a hurry. "A companion to Lady Fenwick until last spring, when Lady Fenwick's daughter married and the position was no longer required. She has been at loose ends since. I thought the country air would do her good." I looked at her. "You have invited a former paid companion to a house party." "I have invited a sensible young woman to my grandson's house," she said, with the precise tranquility of a woman who has never once apologized for anything in 8 decades of life. "Which is also my grandson's house, and therefore mine to populate as I see fit. Eat your eggs." I ate my eggs. I was not alarmed. My grandmother had been attempting to arrange my marriage since the day I turned 30, which was now 5 years ago. She had tried viscounts' daughters and admirals' nieces, and one memorable attempt involving a Scottish heiress who arrived speaking no English and left 3 days later speaking considerably more of it than she had intended, most of it directed at me. I had outlasted them all. I had a title, an estate, a duty to the line, and no desire whatsoever to rush the matter when the right arrangement had not presented itself. My grandmother knew this. She had simply concluded that her methods required refinement. Inviting a companion was, I thought, a misjudgment, even for her. I was wrong. I discovered this on the 2nd day, when I came in from the morning ride to find Miss Voss in the library. I use the word find loosely. She was not hiding. She was sitting at the far end of the long table with a stack of my grandfather's agricultural reports open before her, a notebook at her elbow, and the air of a woman who had entirely forgotten that the library belonged to someone else. She was making notes in a hand I could see from the doorway was both rapid and very small, and she was mouthing figures under her breath. I stood in the doorway for a moment. "Miss Voss," I said. She looked up. She did not startle. She did not flush or rise or begin any of the rapid apologies that the situation would have produced in most guests. She assessed me with those still dark eyes in a way that I found immediately, inexplicably annoying, not with insolence, not with calculation, but with the same quiet attention she had aimed at the dinner table the night before. As though I were a phenomenon she had noted and was now filing in the correct cabinet. "Your Grace," she said, "I am sorry I assumed the library would be unoccupied at this hour. I can remove to the morning room if you prefer." "What are you doing with those reports?" She glanced down at them as if to confirm what she already knew. "Reading them. Your North pasture yields have declined over 3 successive seasons. I wondered if it was the drainage." I walked into the room, and is it? "I think so, yes. There is a pattern in the tenant records your grandfather kept from 1803 to 1811, a similar decline preceded by 2 years of unusual rainfall, corrected when the eastern ditch line was recut. The rainfall records from the past 4 years suggest the same precondition." She paused. "I recognize this is none of my concern." "It is not," I said, "and then because I am a man of reasonable honesty, but you are right about the rainfall." She said nothing. She simply waited, with that quality of attention that I was beginning to find less annoying and considerably more unsettling. "Leave the notebook," I said. "My steward will want to see your figures." She left the notebook. She did not seem pleased or flustered or grateful in the excessive way that would have been its own kind of performance. She seemed, if anything, faintly relieved to have the matter handed to someone who could act on it, and she gathered the remaining papers and withdrew without ceremony. I sat down with the agricultural reports. I did not read a single page for 20 minutes. That evening, my grandmother found me in the billiard room. "I see you met Miss Voss," she said. She was reading my grandfather's drainage records. "Yes," said my grandmother, as though this were the most natural thing in the world and not, in fact, highly unusual by any standard the house party circuit generally recognized. "She has an excellent mind." Her father was a scholar, taught mathematics at a small college before he died when she was 16. She grew up reading whatever he left on his desk, Euclid before breakfast, survey reports in the evening. She once corrected an arithmetic error in a parliamentary land enclosure pamphlet and sent the correction to the relevant committee. She paused. They did not reply naturally, but she was right. "She was a lady's companion," I said, as though repetition might clarify something. "She was a lady's companion who could have been a great many other things, had she been born male or born wealthy." My grandmother settled herself into a chair by the window with the authority of a small and very elderly general taking a position. "She was not, so she is instead a young woman of 8 and 20 with no family, no income, and a mind that has had nothing of sufficient substance to work on in 4 years. I find that a waste." I said nothing. "I have made her a small wager," said my grandmother. I set down my cue. "I beg your pardon." "A private one? I told her that if she could persuade you to recut the eastern ditch line before the spring rains, I would consider her northern pasture problem solved and find her a suitable situation with a family that deserves her." She smoothed her gloves with perfect calm. She accepted. She is not a woman who declines a reasonable proposition. "You wagered on my estate management." "I wagered on your intelligence," said my grandmother, which was, I recognized, a considerably more targeted remark. "I have every confidence in it. I also have every confidence in hers. The result is, I feel, rather predetermined." She stood with the brisk ease of a woman who does not acknowledge the physical limitations of 81 years unless they become truly unavoidable. "Good night, Richard." She left me standing in the billiard room with the distinct sensation that I had already lost something, and was not entirely certain what. I told myself it was irritation. I was very convincing about it. On the 3rd day there was a planned expedition to the eastern ridge, Fenwick and Frederick, and 2 of the younger men going out with guns and a great deal of noise, the ladies remaining at the house for the usual diversions of country visiting. I went with the shooting party and came back early, because Fenwick's idea of sport involved more noise than precision, and I had never had patience for noise. I had been patient for perhaps an hour and a half, and then I had handed my gun to the loader and walked back through the east field by myself, which I found considerably more restorative. I came around the east garden wall and found Miss Voss standing at the field's edge with my head steward, Craddock, who had the look of a man who has just been told something he recognizes as correct and is still working through the inconvenience of it. She had a notebook in her hand, not the one she had left in the library, her own, which she had clearly kept about her person, and she was pointing at something in it with the end of a pencil. Craddock was nodding with increasing reluctance, the way a man nods when he can see no other available response. "Here," she was saying, "and here, if you follow the original 1811 line and extend it 15 yards south, you catch the secondary runoff before it pools against the lower field. The soil profile here is very similar to what your grandfather's reports describe along the eastern boundary." "I," said Craddock, I can see the sense of it." "The cost would be manageable if the work begins before the ground hardens. February would be too late for a proper cut." "November, I'd say." He scratched his chin with the reluctant thoroughness of a man recalculating his season. "Maybe late October, yet if the weather holds another fortnight." "My thoughts exactly. The rainfall records suggest you have perhaps 3 weeks before the first hard frost." I stood at the garden wall and watched my head steward discuss drainage timelines with a woman who had been in my house for 3 days. He had worked for my family for 19 years. He had managed the home farm and the tenant rolls and the entire apparatus of the Thornmere estate through 2 bad harvests and a disputed inheritance and 1 catastrophic dispute over a boundary wall, and he was a man who did not give ground easily. He was giving ground now, and he did not look displeased about it. She looked up and saw me. The expression on her face was not guilty, not caught, not triumphant. It was simply present, watching. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Voss," I looked at Craddock, "is she right?" Craddock had the decency to look neither smug nor apologetic. He was a practical man. "About the drainage? Yes, sir, I think she is. I had been thinking to leave it until spring, but she makes a case for this autumn I can't reasonably argue with." I looked back at her. She had not moved. She was standing in the stubble at the edge of the field with her hem slightly mudded and her pencil still in her hand, and the low afternoon sun was against her face, and she was watching me with that steady, unfrightened patience that I had been trying for 3 days to locate the name for. "Miss Voss," I said, "will you walk with me?" She glanced at Craddock, who had diplomatically found something in his waistcoat pocket to require his complete attention. Then she looked back at me and said, "Yes, Your Grace." We walked. I did not have a plan. I am a man who generally has plans, who organizes his days and his accounts and his correspondence with the precision of someone who has learned early that the alternative is disorder, and disorder is its own kind of cost. But I had no plan that afternoon. I walked because I needed to understand something, and I could not identify what it was, and walking seemed the nearest available substitute for understanding. "Tell me about the wager," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The path curved south toward the kitchen gardens, and there were long shadows across it from the elms, and our footsteps were quiet in the dry grass. "Your grandmother told you," she said at last, not a question. "She enjoys telling me things she expects to be right about." "Then I suppose she told you accurately." She kept her eyes on the path ahead. "She offered me a situation, a recommendation to a family she knows, people she trusts, if I could persuade you to act on the drainage work this season. I accepted because I have been trying to find a suitable situation for 7 months and have not managed it, and because she seemed quite confident, and I have found that confident elderly women are usually right about the things that matter." "And the persuasion," I said, "how did you intend to go about it?" She considered this as though it were a reasonable question, which I suppose it was. "I intended to show you the figures and leave the rest to your intelligence." Which seems to have worked reasonably well, given that Craddock appears to be scheduling the work. Something moved through me then, something warm and wry and entirely unexpected, and I had to look away at the tree line for a moment before I could trust my face. "You were not worried," I said, "that I might be offended, that a guest in my house was reviewing my estate records and then redirecting my steward?" "I was a little worried about it," she said, with a directness that was equal parts refreshing and alarming. "But less worried than I was about the North Pasture. The pasture is a real problem that will cost you considerably more in 3 years if it is not addressed. Your offense would have been temporary if it had come at all." "How did you know it would have been temporary?" She glanced at me sideways just briefly. "Because you came to look at what Craddock and I were doing," she said, "rather than walking away. A man who is truly offended walks away. You came to look." I stopped on the path. She stopped too, a step ahead of me, and turned to face me with that still, patient face, and I understood in that moment what the quality was that I had been unable to name for 3 days. It was not indifference. It was not calculation. It was the particular quality of a person who has learned to see things clearly because no one has ever given her the luxury of seeing them otherwise. She had spent 4 years as an invisible woman in other people's houses. She had done their correspondence and managed their arrangements and sat with their difficult relatives and been thanked with a salary and forgotten as soon as the season ended and the usefulness was concluded. She had not become bitter. She had not become careful in the strategic way of women who learn to perform smallness as self-protection. She had simply become precise. She saw what was real. She said it plainly. She made no apology for the seeing. I found that I could not look away from her. "Miss Voss," I said, and my voice came out quieter than I had intended, "do you want the situation my grandmother has promised you?" She looked at me steadily. Something shifted in those dark eyes, a fraction, a question, the nearest thing to uncertainty I had seen on her face. "Yes," she said, "I need it. And if I were to offer you something else?" The words arrived before I had consciously decided to say them. I am not certain I decided to say them at all. They seemed to come from some part of myself that had been paying attention for 3 days while the rest of me was occupied with pretending not to. The silence that followed was the longest I had experienced in many years. "That would depend," she said at last, "on what else you meant." It was not coy, it was not arch. It was entirely, simply honest, measured, and steady, and not one shade more or less than the truth required. She was not going to pretend she did not know what I was edging toward. She was not going to make it easier or harder than it was. She was going to look at me and wait, with that quality of attention, and let me find the words myself. "Stay through the fortnight," I said. "I would like to continue the conversation." I felt absurdly like a young man at his first ball, which is to say I felt entirely unlike myself, which is to say I felt more like myself than I had in years. "And then I would like to ask you a serious question, if you are willing." She studied me for a long moment. The afternoon light was low and gold against the field, and the rooks were moving in the elms at the far end of the path, and I was aware of all of it with a sharpness that was slightly uncomfortable and entirely new. "I am willing," she said, and then just barely, "Your Grace." I let out a breath I had not known I was holding. We walked back to the house in a silence that felt, for the first time since the guests had arrived, entirely comfortable. The fortnight that followed was the strangest of my adult life, and the most wakeful. She stayed. My grandmother watched us with the satisfied tranquility of a general reviewing a campaign that has gone precisely to plan, and said very little, which was itself a form of communication I had learned to read years ago. Lord Fenwick and his wife departed on the 5th day, which improved the quality of conversation at dinner measurably. Miss Calverley and her mother left on the 6th, with a look from Mrs. Calverley in my direction that I chose not to acknowledge. The Marchioness of Bradday lingered another week with her daughters, and I have strong reason to believe she had written her account of the situation back to London before she was fully in her carriage on the final morning, because I received 2 letters from cousins I had not heard from in years, both extremely solicitous about my welfare and both angling, with varying degrees of subtlety, for information. I did not attend to the cousins. I attended to Miss Voss. We talked in the library, where she had resumed her work through my grandfather's records with my full permission and a better chair. One I had moved to that end of the table myself, without quite acknowledging that I had done so. We talked at dinner, where Frederick, who had stayed on at my express invitation and showed no sign of curiosity about why, watched the 2 of us with an expression of delighted bewilderment he was not nearly skilled enough to conceal. We walked in the afternoons when the weather allowed, and when it did not we sat in the library on opposite sides of the long table, and she worked through the accounts and I read or attended to correspondence, and we spoke intermittently about things that mattered to both of us: the management of the home farm, the question of the parish school's roof, a pamphlet on drainage engineering she had found on the lower shelves and requested my opinion on. I gave it. She gave hers. We disagreed on 2 points, and were both correct, and neither of us required the other to pretend otherwise. I discovered over those days that she had read enormously, not in the polished way of women who have been directed toward the correct novels and the improving essays, but in the hungry and largely unsupervised way of a girl who had a scholar's library at her disposal, and no one to tell her what was suitable. She had read mathematics and natural philosophy and agricultural theory, and a considerable amount of history. She had also read novels, and had strong opinions about which ones were worth the candle and which were not, and these opinions were not always the ones I expected. She had been invisible for 4 years. She was not invisible to me. On the 9th evening, we were in the library after dinner, she at her end with Craddock's cost estimates spread before her, making revisions in that small, rapid hand, and I was at my end attempting to read correspondence that had arrived that afternoon. The fire had burned low. The house was quiet. Frederick had gone to bed at a reasonable hour for once. "Miss Voss," I said. "Yes, Your Grace. I told you 11 days ago that I wished to ask you a serious question." She looked up from her papers. Her expression was very still. "You did." "I have been working toward it," I said, somewhat slowly, I recognize. "I have noticed." The corner of her mouth moved, just barely, and I felt it somewhere entirely disproportionate to what it was. "I would like to ask it now," I said, "if you will tell me first whether the answer is entirely hopeless." She set down her pencil. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at me with those dark, steady eyes, and I was grateful, sharply, unexpectedly grateful, that she did not look away. "It is not entirely hopeless," she said, "Your Grace." I crossed the library. It is not a small library. My grandfather was a collector of some enthusiasm, and it felt like the longest distance I had ever crossed on my own estate. I stood at the other end of the table and looked at her and said, "Elinor." She did not object to the name. "Will you marry me?" The silence was brief. She had been thinking about it for 11 days. I understood afterward, thinking about it in that careful, methodical way she thought about everything, turning it over and examining it from each angle, checking the pattern against the available record. She was not a woman who arrived at conclusions carelessly, but she had arrived at this one already, I think. She had simply been waiting for me to ask it plainly. "Yes," she said. And then, with the particular dry warmth that I had come to recognize as the register she used when she was moved, and did not wish to seem overwhelmed by it, "I suppose I shall have to tell your grandmother that I won the wager." I laughed. I cannot tell you the last time I laughed like that, not the managed, measured laugh of drawing rooms and county dinners, but the real thing, sudden and full and entirely unguarded. She looked at me with something I can only describe as wondering, as though she had not quite expected the sound of it, and found it, on consideration, surprisingly good. I gave her my hand. She took it and stood, and I held it longer than the moment strictly required, and neither of us remarked on this. My grandmother received the news in the gold drawing-room that same evening with the expression of a woman who has been right about something significant, and is generous enough not to say so out loud more than once. She took Elinor's hands in both of hers and held them for a long moment and said, "I told you, my dear." That was all. But her eyes were very bright, and when she released Elinor's hands, she pressed them once firmly, and that one press communicated rather more than a speech would have done. Frederick demanded to be told the precise sequence of events in chronological order. He received a partial accounting, which he then supplemented with his own theories. None of his theories were correct, but they were so generous in their assessment of me that I did not feel able to correct them. We were married in December, quietly in the chapel at Thornmere, with my grandmother in the front pew in the silver gray she reserved for occasions she considered victories, and Frederick at my side, and a small gathering of people who had the good sense to treat the day as what it was rather than as material for correspondence. Elinor's only family was a great-aunt of advanced years and limited mobility who sent a letter of warm congratulations and a pair of very fine silver candlesticks. I sent a carriage for her and she came, and she sat beside my grandmother, and the two of them regarded the proceedings with the shared satisfaction of elderly women who have seen enough of the world to know what matters. Elinor wore gray silk. It was December, and she said she had no intention of shivering in white, and she walked to me with the same unhurried, unperforming dignity she brought to everything. And she looked at me when she took her place beside me the way she had looked at me on the field path 2 months earlier, with full, settled attention, as though she had examined all available options and found this one, on reflection, the correct choice. When the chaplain concluded the service and turned us to face the small congregation, I held both her hands and said, quietly for her alone, "I am very glad you stayed for the fortnight." She looked at me, and the careful stillness of her face broke into something open and warm and entirely her own, something I had only glimpsed in snatches in the library or on the afternoon walks, and now had in full, and she said, "I am glad your grandmother cheats at wagers." We drove back to Thornmere through the December lanes, frost on the hedgerows and gray sky overhead, and the carriage lamp casting warm light between us. Elinor sat beside me with her gloved hand in mine, looking out at the frozen fields and the bare oaks and the long, familiar line of the park wall coming into view. And I thought, with the particular clarity that cold winter light sometimes produces, that a woman who can read a drainage report, persuade a 19-year steward, see through a duke in 3 days, and still maintain the honesty not to pretend she found any of it easy was a considerably better match than anything the last 5 years of careful avoidance had offered me. I thought also, with something approaching awe, that my grandmother had known this in October, had known it, perhaps, before October, had selected her wager with the precision of a woman who never placed one she did not intend to win. She has never let me forget it. She is 81 and still sharp as a Sheffield blade, and she sits at the far end of the dinner table, in the chair where Elinor used to sit on that first evening in her ash-colored gown. And she watches us both with the comfortable satisfaction of a woman who has arranged things correctly and sees no reason to be modest about it. She is right, she is generally right. I have stopped arguing with her about it, which she regards, I believe, as the most significant improvement in my character that marriage has produced. Elinor, to no one's surprise, has not argued with her once. They work together in the mornings on the household accounts and the parish school correspondence, and whatever current difficulty the estate tenants have produced, and they do it in the precise and companionable way of two people who have each spent a great deal of their lives thinking clearly in rooms that were not designed to accommodate them, and found in each other the company of someone who knows what that costs and does not require it to be explained. I watch them sometimes from the doorway of the library, and I feel what I can only call fortune, not the passive fortune of a man who has stumbled into something good, but the sharp, daily, active fortune of a man who knows exactly what he has and knows the various small chances that had to hold for him to have it. My grandmother's stubbornness, a morning in the library, a wager placed on an overlooked woman by the one person in the household with the clarity to see her clearly. The north pasture, for what it is worth, improved considerably the following summer. The yields came back to the 1809 numbers by August, which Craddock noted in his quarterly report with the understated satisfaction of a man who has been proven right about something he was persuaded into. He told Elinor before he told me. I did not mind in the least. There is a particular quality to the evenings now at Thornmere that I did not have words for in the first year, and am not certain I have words for now. Only that it is the quality of a house that is being lived in by people who are genuinely present in it. I was not before genuinely present. I moved through the rooms of Thornmere as a man moves through the rooms of a house he manages, but does not inhabit, capable, attentive to the accounts and the tenants and the seasonal rhythms of the estate, but not truly there in the way that another person can make you there simply by being in the same room and expecting you to be as well. Elinor expects me to be present. Not in a demanding way. She is not a woman who makes demands in the ordinary sense. She expects it because she is present herself, entirely, in everything she undertakes, and there is something in that quality of attention that makes its own kind of claim on you. You cannot be vague or elsewhere in the company of someone who is watching the world with that steady, unflinching interest. You find yourself watching it, too. We had been married 8 months when I came in from the home farm one afternoon to find her in conversation with 3 of the estate wives in the kitchen garden. Not the formal kind of conversation in which a duchess receives tenants, but the working kind, with a plan laid out on the old potting table between them and her notebook open beside it, and the women talking to her with the directness they reserved for people they had decided to trust. I stood at the gate for a long moment without announcing myself, watching. She was listening more than she was speaking, which I had come to understand was how she always worked, gathering first, speaking when she had something of value to add. When she spoke, the 3 women listened in turn. One of them laughed. Elinor smiled, and it was the full, unguarded version, the one I had first seen in the chapel. I went back to the library and did not announce that I had been at the gate, because I did not want to interrupt the work. But I sat at the long table where she and I had first occupied opposite ends, and I thought about what a wager can win when it is placed by someone who knows the odds clearly, and I thought about what it costs a woman of considerable gifts to spend 4 years making herself small enough to be useful in rooms that were not hers. I thought she will never have to make herself small in this room. I thought I will spend the rest of my life making sure the rooms in her life are large enough for her. This is, I recognize, an unusual line of reflection for a Duke of Thornmere. My predecessors were not men notably given to such thinking. But I have the advantage of a grandmother who is 81 and still right about everything, and a wife who taught my steward about drainage and my tenant wives about kitchen gardens and who will, I am fairly certain, teach me about a great many other things before we are through. I am looking forward to it.